So context for this video is we gave a talk to a pre-med interest group for high school students at the community college here, and thought it would be a good idea to record some of the major talking points and see if that's helpful for anyone as they figure out their path to medicine, if that's something they want to do and pursue or not, and just get more information.
Why don't you do your intro?
That was it.
No, like for you personally.
Oh, for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
All right.
Okay. So I'm Megan. I am a brand new fourth year medical student interested in anesthesiology. So that's my introduction.
And I'm Patton, and I am board certified in emergency medicine. And I also did my first residency in family medicine. So I was dual boarded for a number of years, and I let my family medicine go and just maintained my emergency medicine board certification. And I'm retired partially.
Mm-hmm. And that's my dad.
Yeah, that's my baby.
Okay, so some of the questions that the students had, which I thought were important to address, they were how long to prep for the MCAT, how long should they study for the MCAT before they sit for the exam, what resources should they use, should they invest in books. Some questions were about step 1 being pass-fail, does that put more emphasis on step 2 scores, and do you remember any other questions that they had? How to be a strong applicant. I know one student had these extracurricular interests, and she wondered if that would be beneficial to include in her personal statement, and we thought that that's really important.
Yeah.
What she does outside of her academic pursuits.
Yeah, she had multiple interests
Mm-hmm.
and did very well at
Yeah. So I'm going to go through this talk that I gave those students and answered some of those questions along the way. So we talked to them, since these are high school kids, we tried to do a very basic overview about path to medicine. So there are 4-year post-bac programs, and these aren't comprehensive, but post-bac meaning after your 4 years of undergrad, you have an additional 4 years of school. So that would be the MD program, the DO program, optometry, dental school, audiology, just some examples. And then a 2-year post-bac program would be PA school. And then there's also CRNA, which is an extensive training process, ultrasound tech, rad tech, with radiology tech, EMT, paramedic. Those are some paths to medicine if they aren't necessarily interested in going the MD route. So then I went into why MD for me, and I love the depth and the breadth of the info that I would get from a medical doctorate education and MD school. I love those nitty-gritty science details on the cellular level and how that impacts the bigger picture of why someone's sick. So I love the why of medical science, and I can get as detailed as I want in med school. So my path was non-traditional. I had a BA in international studies. I worked for 6 years before applying, and since I applied 2 cycles, I ultimately worked for 8 years before I started med school and got accepted on my 2nd attempt at applying to medical school. I took the MCAT twice, and my score improved from the first to the second time, and I attributed that to weekly practice tests and then subsequent reviews. So for 8 weeks before I took my 2nd MCAT, and so that was, I took a practice test on a Sunday, and then I would spend that whole week reviewing and strengthening all my weak points. Then I'd take another practice test on a Sunday, and I did that for 8 weeks, and that's where I really saw an improvement in my score. I used Leah Fish, F-I-S-C-H, Leah for Sci, really helped me set a basic science foundation, because I didn't get that in my undergrad education. I really had to start from scratch. And then I used practice tests from, it was Next Step MCAT when I took it, but I think now it's renamed Blueprint. And then I used Khan Academy as a free resource.
How do you spell Khan?
K-H-A-N.
Okay. And we'll have those all linked with your Word document.
Yeah, and I think all of the influencers these days say it's not sponsored. You have to specify that. I don't know all the rules, but it's not. It's not sponsored. It just, these are resources I used.
Yeah, this is you'll find out quickly our channel is not sponsored by anybody.
Just by our own love and commitment.
And probably viewed by our family only.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say about the MCAT prep is that I remember is don't do subject matter review. You can, but the best way to do it is like Megan said, take the practice test and then go over the things that you got wrong on the practice test. Learn that way. Let that be your subject matter review, but don't think that you're just going to study acid-base chemistry and then go and be able to nail the questions. The way they ask the questions, there's an art to interpreting that, and you can have all of the subject matter knowledge in your head and still get the question wrong. So the key is look and see how they ask the questions.
Yeah, learning what the test wants from you is much more important than sinking a bunch of time and money into, and this touches on one of the students' questions, was whether or not to invest in those big books to do that kind of review. And I was kind of saying, not really, not as the sole source, as a, if you do notice that you keep missing a topic on a practice test, use that as a resource to reinforce your knowledge or get that really solid foundation so you stop missing those questions. But relying on it, you're going to see, oh my gosh, I don't know 1,000 pages of stuff, and that is easy to get lost in and distracts you from the ultimate goal, which is learning how to take the MCAT, which you can really only do through practice questions and practice tests.
Yeah.
And also not to neglect the CARS section, which I don't really know what all that stands for. Reasoning skills, something.
Yeah.
And
it used to be the verbal.
Verbal, yeah. And I thought I would have that nailed. I knew my weak point was science and that I was going to really have to work on my science foundation. And I really actually needed to learn how to do the CARS section, even though I felt really proficient in my verbal reasoning skills. The tests ask they want to elicit certain skills from you, and I had to practice that, even though I felt that I would be really strong in my reasoning skills.
Yeah, I think the tendency, particularly when I took it, was people would neglect studying for the verbal portion, and now it's the CARS, and for that very reason. But the way to make huge jumps would be in like physical sciences. You could make a huge jump by studying a little bit. On the verbal CARES subject, you have to really work hard just to increase 1 point, for example. And so put your time in that, because you don't want that score pulling your overall score down.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And so then in addition to studying for the MCAT, I was working full time. So I took night classes at the local community college for 3 years to fulfill my required prerequisites, which were biology, gen chem, organic chemistry, physics, and microbiome for my specific program. Those were the science requirements that I had to fulfill, and I had not really taken any science in undergraduate, and even if I did, it had been 7 years after I'd taken them, and by that time those classes expire and I'd have to retake them anyway. Then I also volunteered in the ED and inpatient hospice on Saturdays or after work. So that's really, I mean, it was a long journey to even apply to medical school for me, because I had to take all those night classes and really bolster my application to show my interest in medical science.
And you already had your degree.
Yeah, I already had my degree.
In international studies. And so you had to go back and add your science requirements, which actually for you worked out fine, because you didn't have to repeat anything.
Yeah, it was all new for me. So I'll go into the MD program structure real quick. This is pretty basic. Again, the audience for this talk was high school students. So there's
but they were advanced. They were collegiate students that had, some of them already had a year of their college underway.
And a lot of this, when I was going over the MD program structure, they already knew it. They knew about step one, step two, so they are very motivated. So I felt like the hardest part of med school was getting in. That was such a grind. And then once I got in, I've had a blast this whole time. It's really fun. I felt like the school does want to keep you in. And so I remember one of my biggest fears was, am I going to fail out? Is this a program I'm going to fail out of? And the schools, at least my school, for the most part, really is motivated to keep students in the program. And so there's resources to help, there's support, someone to talk to, and they want you to succeed. So there's years 1 and 2, which are your preclinical academic years, where you have your anatomy courses, and then you're building your medical science foundation through like metabolism, defense, which is like biochemistry, immunology, virology, bacteriology, and then you go through your systems. So there's pulmonary, renal, cardiovascular, GI, neuro, and then you take step 1. That culminates your first and second years, your preclinical years. And then some programs require that you pass step 1 before you can move on to your clinical rotations, which was my case. And then that wasn't the case when you went to med school necessarily.
No, and we had a little bit different layout. Our didactic years, the book years, were our first 2 years, and we did have introduction to clinical practice that got heavier each semester. But we had a hard cutoff, so we finished 2 complete school years of didactic training, which was all the book. The second year was a little bit more clinical than the first year. And then everybody took step 1 on the same day in June. It took 6 weeks or so to get the results back. By that time, we had already started our 3rd year rotations in July was the beginning. There were only 5 in my class that failed step 1, I think, but they continued their rotation and they took it again in September. All 5 of those in my class passed, so I don't know what would have happened had they not passed. If they probably would have stopped their clinical rotations at that point. And but your class is set up a little bit different because you start your clinical rotations after a year and a half of didactic. And so you get a jump on it. And that's why you're in your first and second rotation of your 4th year, even though we're still in April.
Right. Yeah, we had an accelerated preclinical course. So yes. So we kind of have 2 4th-year classes at my school right now. The 4th-year class that just matched, and myself and my cohort who are just now starting 4th year. Yeah. So then when you start the clinical immersion phase, which is typically year 3, for my school, we rotate through internal medicine, family medicine, emergency medicine, pediatrics, OB-GYN, surgery, psych, and neuro. And not getting exposure to all the specialties. We had a couple weeks of anesthesia, but you might not necessarily get exposure to radiology or a lot of the surgical subspecialties during your 3rd year. And then your 3rd year, you didn't have neuro.
I don't remember neuro specifically, unless it was tied in with psychiatry. It was not a separate rotation.
So I'm sure that varies from program to program, but there's the core. The core is IM, FM, EM, PEDS, OB-GYN, surgery, psych, probably.
Yeah, we had very robust psych programs.
And then year 4 is your individualization phase, where you get to pick your rotations based on your interests. And you don't necessarily need to have your mind made up about what specialty you want to go into, but it's a good way to narrow it down and to start figuring out which direction you want to take your career. And it's also a great chance to gain exposure to specialties that you didn't get to experience in year 3. And you can maybe also have away rotations. It's an option. Then this is also when you take step 2 and apply for residency during your 4th year. And one of the questions that we had from the students was about step 1 now being pass-fail, and then step 2, is there going to be a heavier weight on that scored test that we take? And I think my class, the class of 2024, is the first class to have the step 1 be pass fail and to have this step 2 be scored. So I don't think there's enough information yet to see how this is going to pan out, if it's going to make a difference in terms of if they look at step 2 more, if they scrutinize it more. But I still, my goal is just to succeed and to get as high a score as possible. If that hasn't changed at all based on the pass fail from step 1.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see since you guys are the first. I feel like for us it was the high score on step 1 seemed to be very important, and then step 2, I think you just want to be as high as you can on anything that's graded.
Yeah.
Particularly, what do you think the most competitive residencies are right now?
In terms of like who's looking at they want you to have a really competitive step 2 score.
Yeah.
I mean, I know just from hearing my classmates talk, neurosurgery, which is classic for having a competitive score. Gosh, maybe dermatology.
Yeah.
Ophthalmology.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the surgical. I'm not entirely well versed on. Vascular surgery. I know they have their own residency path.
So the road rule probably still is intact. It was radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesia, and derm in the 90s.
Okay.
And that was called the road to happiness. and I remember orthopedics was very competitive, and radiology was very competitive at the time. Emergency medicine was competitive then, and I think it was because of the TV show ER.
Oh yeah.
And that's partially why I picked family medicine, just because I was going into the military, and there was only 2 or 3 slots that we knew that were going to be open that year, and I didn't want to be a general medical officer in the military. I wanted to go ahead and get a residency under my belt, so that was kind of the safe bet.
Yeah. So then the next important thing, especially to the students, they were very curious about this section, were the emphasis on the longitudinal aspect of their med school application. And so some things they could do now to invest in being a really strong candidate for med school. And so one of the things I emphasized was establishing a mentor relationship in order to get really strong letters of recommendation. And so I think building those longitudinal relationships starting now, that can demonstrate their work ethic, their skills, their interests, and then they can get a strong letter of rec. I mean, I ran into the issue of not investing in longitudinal relationships really because I was starting from scratch, so it was kind of hard, but I did invest in going to the office hours with my physics professor, and he was able to give me a good letter of recommendation. And then I really tried to make an effort to establish relationships with my professors, my basic science professors at the time at the community college. And so I think it's important and something that they could do right now, even though they're 18, I guess they're finishing up high school. It's still something super important for them to start now, so they're not rushing and scrambling in the last month or 2 before they're set to apply to try and build relationships.
Yeah, and I remember your struggle was you applied your first year to MD only.
Right.
And then you were considering opening up your applications to the DO schools, the Doctor of Osteopathies, who, and, of course, in the military, I had a lot of colleagues and friends that were DOs and willing to give you a recommendation, but really each school wants you to have somebody that's your mentor or writing your letter of rec that's in that specialty.
Right.
So if you're applying to allopathic schools, they want you to have MD recommendations. If you're doing osteopathic schools, they want a doctor of osteopathy to be your the person that knows you to recommend you. And so that's something that you have to, if you want to apply to both, which I think is a great idea, then you certainly need to make contacts in both specialties.
Absolutely. Yeah, after the first time, and I didn't get in that med school application cycle, I did open up my field, and so my field of view, and I wanted to see maybe, DO school, PA school, paramedic school, and so I started looking at all those requirements, and it wasn't so much that one program was easier to get into than the other. They each had their own hurdles, and so I had to take all those factors into consideration when I went to apply again. And so I know for the MD program, I personally did not have a physician letter of recommendation. I had 2 letters each from my boss in my 2 different career paths that I had taken. And then I had 2 science professor letter of recommendations. But I think it's really valuable to have a physician letter of recommendation for an MD school, and then whichever school program you apply to, whether it's DO or PA. I know PA, in one of the programs I was looking at, wants only health science professional letters of recommendation, and ideally have known you for longer than a year, or at least a year. So that's just something that I told the students to be thinking about, because that is
make those contacts early on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then consider leadership opportunities, which I'm sure all those students are leaders in some form or fashion, because they're all very motivated.
Very gung-ho.
Yeah, it was cute. And so I was just kind of telling them, create your own group or take on more responsibility in already established interest groups or volunteer organizations. And we had one of their professors was there giving them other ideas of opportunities that they can take advantage of at their local institution. So that was one piece of advice.
Yeah, he had mentors that were very interested in students. And I told them also, you may have to search a little bit and find somebody that really does enjoy spending time and makes time for you, because it may not be the first person that you think of. And then somebody that will actually write the letter and, put some details about you in there. So that you may have to have one and maybe a backup, and then see who turns out the better product. I remember I worked for an ophthalmology group, and the person I thought least, the newest person to the practice, I looked at his letter, and he was also had been an English major, and English and chemistry or something, and his writing skills were impeccable, and he wrote the most interesting letter of recommendation, and I was so thankful for him. And he was the one that I knew the least amount of time.
Yeah.
But I felt like he went way above and beyond.
Yeah. And so it is one of those where if you don't find a mentor with the first person that you ask, just keep trying until you find someone who's really motivated to take you under their wing and be that strong letter of recommendation for you. And then one of the last things I mentioned, you also brought up a good point about if there are research opportunities.
Yeah, research is always big. And it kind of, because when it doesn't play as much of a part in medical school unless you do an MD, PhD program, which you'll start off earlier with your research project. But almost every residency has a research requirement to whether you're just taking blood pressures, for example, for some type of study. But if you can get your name on a paper as an undergrad, that's going to look really good on your package, just because, because that's going to be part of your residency. And it kind of gets you in that mode of investigation early on.
Yes. And no matter how small of a role you might play on that research team, know what they were researching, know it very well, because you will likely get asked that during your med school interview, and it's going to be important. Even if you were just doing data collection or phone calls, just make sure that you know what the research project was, what they were looking for, maybe if there were any results. Just know it well, no matter how small of a role you might have played on the team. And yeah, make sure you can answer that question solidly at your interviews.
And then I remember that's when I told them the student that asked right away if her, the fact that she was a black belt and a ballerina.
Oh yes, yeah.
Would help her, and I said, of course. And during my interview, I got one science question about my biology degree, and I got it wrong. And I had about 20 questions about why I had a degree in Spanish as well. And the majority of my interview was on the Spanish degree. And you'd think it would be the opposite, and then I ended up getting in. So
yeah, and yeah, that was one of the other things we had talked about was the initial your MCAT score and your GPA, those academic factors, are going to be the thing that separates you from the thousands of applications they get in. So I feel like they have this first sorting episode where they are going to select based on scores. So that's very important to have strong scores. And after that, then what distinguishes you from everybody who has great scores is going to be those extracurriculars, that Spanish degree, that black belt training, the ballerina experience. Those are going to be the things that separate you from the other thousands of applicants that also have a great MCAT and a great GPA. So yeah, and those are the things. I maybe also got one science question during my interview, and the rest was about everything else, my other jobs, my other experiences. And then, so looking at all the requirements per your program of interest. So what classes are required? What experiences are they looking for? What are the expiration dates of classes? If you're a non-traditional student, or if you're taking your science classes now, but you might want to work after undergraduate and not go straight in, knowing when those classes are no longer valid, sometimes between 5 and 7 years. And so for like DO, this is just very not comprehensive at all, but maybe they have a lower MCAT or GPA threshold, but they want you to shadow and have experience with and have a letter of recommendation from a DO, a practicing DO. And you need to know why you want to go into a doctor of osteopathy, why that program specifically. And then for PA school, it's a 2-year program usually. They might have lower GPA thresholds. You don't have to take the MCAT, but you do have to take the GRE. And one program I was looking at required 1,000 hours of direct patient care, hands-on care, 1,000 hours of that before you even apply. So I remember when I was looking at PA school, I didn't think I could swing 1,000 hours because I already had a full-time job. And so that was just not something I could manage at that time. And some jobs I've seen prospective PA students in, they were scribes, certified nurse assistants, medical techs, and those are some of the job options that I've seen before even applying to PA school.
Yeah, and I think being a scribe in the ER, like a lot of the bigger hospital that I work in, they have ER scribes, and the overwhelming majority of them are trying to work their medical school application process, and they've learned a great deal. So they've got the terminology down, they know the electronic medical record much better than I do, and then they really get to soak in all this patient care. So they know, do I like the ER, or would I rather be in something that's a little bit more controlled versus a chaotic environment of the ER? So they get really kind of a blast introduction to medicine. But that's a great way, and you get paid to be a scribe. So.
Yeah. And then for paramedic school that I researched where I lived, it was about 2.5 years or 5 semesters, but you already needed to be an EMT and have certain biology classes, and then there's also an entrance exam. So I thought that was just also something not feasible because I'd have to pay for EMT school, then I'd have to work as an EMT before I could even apply to paramedic school. And these were all factors I was considering during my second application attempt to MD school. And it was interesting to see all the different requirements. It was not necessarily that one program is easier than the other to get into. It's just what else do they require? What other hurdles might you have to jump through? So it's just good now, if you're pre-med, to look and see what programs are you interested in and what do they require, because it might take years for you to get those requirements. And then there was one question that I remembered. It was about financial aid and how to get support. And I know each program has their own scholarships and grants, and then there's also national opportunities.
State.
Yeah.
And local, because Sean was saying that they had plenty of local things as well. But I think he was focused more on state. Each state has, he said there's so many opportunities for scholarships.
And you would fill out the FAFSA, which is the same as you do for college, and that kind of can guide what you're eligible for scholarship or grant wise. And then if you do end up having to take out full loans, then there's also things to consider, like the health professions scholarship. There's the Native American reservation healthcare programs where you might have some loan forgiveness after you graduate, and you practice in some rural medicine areas as well. And so there are different options. So it's good to start looking into financial aspects of your education.
Yeah, and if you're at all interested in the military, if you're prior service, or if you think you might like a military career, the military has a wonderful medical education system.
Mm-hmm.
They have their own medical school, which is one of the harder ones in the nation to get into, and their training programs are unbelievable. You can go to Hawaii and do your rotations. The scholarships are unbelievable, and but you do have to pay back your time in the military, which I did, and had no intention on staying into retirement. But when I looked at people on the outside, I was like, I think I'll stay in. It was such a great environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the last things we talked about with this group was this journey to medicine it's lifelong, and there's always going to be something to apply for, like getting into medical school. There's always going to be something to do for that right now. Once you get in, there's going to be the next exam, and then there's going to be your step exams, and then when you graduate medical school, there's going to be step 3, and then there's going to be your boards at the end of residency. And it's always going to be something. It's going to be a years long journey, a lifelong journey. And so we really emphasize having fun. It might not be fun right now as they're applying to medical school, but once they get in,
don't delay joy.
Yeah, don't delay your joy.
No foreboding joy, as Brene Brown would say.
And just
it's easy to do.
And enjoy the process. It's going to be super hard, but I've had a blast my whole 3 years so far. And there's been hard times and struggles for sure, but I've never regretted it. I've always really tried to find the joy along the way, and I think that's going to be so important. Don't postpone anything. Like right now, for example, I'm on my dedicated step 2 prep, but I wanted to come see my parents in Florida, and that's really important to me. And I think in the scheme of things, when I look back on med school, I'm not going to be like, man, I wish I had those 5 days to study for step 2. I'm going to be much more happy making memories with my family. And even though I am studying nearly every day here, but just don't delay that joy. Still have fun throughout the process.
Yeah, enjoy the process
Mm-hmm.
of becoming a doctor.
Yeah.
And then after you are a doctor, enjoy the process of just, it's a wonderful career. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking, oh, well, I'll enjoy med school after step 1. No, after step 2, I'll enjoy it because then I'll be graduating. No, after step 3, then I can get my license. No, after my board certification, then I'll start enjoying myself. And it's very easy to get into that. And I wish I had been just more aware of that and enjoyed the process. And I wish I would have kind of kept up with my classmates a little bit better. And but yeah, it's so much fun. It's fun going back to med school through my daughter.
Yeah. And I love talking to this high school group of pre-med interested students. It's just so much fun.
Yeah.
I love looking back, even though I'm still in the med school process. It's fun to look at the classes that are coming up behind and talking with them, and it's I
and don't get discouraged. I remember how many times you got discouraged thinking this is not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember any particular time that stands out as there's no way I'm going to be a doctor?
Oh gosh.
Or no way I'm going to get into med school?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I often thought before getting into med school that there's no way this is going to happen. So I was like, okay, you need to be a pragmatist, and you need to look at other opportunities besides medicine or besides med school in particular.
You remember any one certain thing?
I remember the first time I took my MCAT and didn't get the ideal score, I was like, this is the end of the road. This is it.
Yeah, I failed organic chemistry, and I was like, well, nobody gets in med school with an F, so I'm done.
Yeah.
And so 8 years later, I got in, but I gave up for several years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it took me, I was mourning that terrible MCAT score, the first one I had. I was so sad about it. I was grieving all my med school dreams just vanished
And
before
it wasn't
my
that bad,
eyes.
though.
No, it wasn't that bad. But yeah, I know I can be dramatic, but but I didn't get in with it. I didn't get in that cycle with that score, and so I let myself grieve for about a week, and then I just started studying again. And I feel like that's kind of the trend throughout med school is maybe I get a bad test grade, or I'm really not doing well on practice tests, and I let myself just be so down for a day, and then I wake up with renewed enthusiasm and determination, and you just keep going. And I feel like that's kind of the trend throughout this process for me.
What was your what changed in your prep for the MCAT? Because the MCAT's a big deal. What changed between your first and second time? Because I know that I gave you some hints. What changed between your studying for the first time versus the second time? Because you definitely adjusted fire on that.
I did, yeah. But the first time I was just focusing on subjects, which was what you're saying not to do. So I was reading books, using all kinds of online resources just to get a basic science foundation. And I was so scattered. I didn't do any practice tests, maybe one, hardly any practice questions. And what changed was I did a regimented 8-week practice test and review schedule. And I think that's what increased my score by about 10 points. Yeah,
and then I've noticed during your clinical rotations, when you take your shelf exams, you've done really well with that same technique.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there was a time where right when they started, the shelf exams in my third year clinical started, I was figuring out my rhythm, and once I went back to the practice tests and doing those and reviewing my weaknesses based on the practice tests, that's when I saw an improvement in my shelf scores for me personally, and I have found good success with that. And that's going to be my study strategy for step 2 as well, is just taking a practice test and reviewing, just pounding those practice tests is my plan.
And I feel like it's the same way for your board. Your board research a little bit different now, but my first family medicine board research, all I did was questions, and then I studied my weak points, like the immunization schedule for pediatrics, for example, which is always big in peds. And just doing the questions really, I basically was 80th percentile with just doing that. And I had one of my friends who I consider to be a genius not do as well on his research, but I think I did 900 questions. And it really helped, and I passed with ease. I think that's pretty typical. Then what else did we finish on? Is that it?
I think that was it. That was the last of my topics, and just enjoying the journey.
So anything that you guys think of that you want, I'll have my guest speaker back at my back anytime I want.
Your beck and call.
Yeah, my beck and call. And so just put the questions down below. I will contact Megan and get the answer for you, and appreciate it. Hope this helps somebody.
I know, I hope so. And good luck on whatever path you decide to choose.
Just do it. Don't, when something goes wrong, just, dust yourself off and keep going, because it will. You're going to fail organic or something.
Something will happen.
But people get in with F's. I'm living proof of it.
Awesome.
Cool.